Like, I remember entire hours where we would just talk, almost just like philosophy sessions about what it means to make music, what it means to conjure sound. I would leave having barely played, but leave with a head full of things to think about when I go home and practice. So I'm not just practicing by rote, so I'm not just learning notes and trying to hit the mark of numbers, but so I'm learning how to imbue it with something.
This is Arts Educators Save the World, where successful artists and their mentors talk about how arts education transformed their lives. Hey, welcome back to Arts Educators Save the World, a podcast where successful artists and their mentors talk about the impact of arts education on both their lives. Today, I am flying solo, but worry not, because I got to talk with one of my very best friends in the world and composer of this podcast theme song, musician Dan Lipton. I actually just got back from seeing Dan perform at Ravinia, which is one of the great outdoor music venues in the country. It's outside Chicago, where he was playing with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and with performers Kelly O'Hara and Sutton Foster. Dan is Kelly O'Hara's music director, and he writes and arranges music for her. And so I got to see him up on the Ravinia stage with the CSO and these two world-class singers performing some standards, also some original music that he wrote. It was just phenomenal. And so today, I am excited to share with you a conversation between Dan and myself and his longest standing piano teacher, Gena Raps. Dan went to a pre-professional music school in New York City growing up, which is, to call it an informal education space is not true. It's a highly formalized curriculum. It is very much like a school, but it doesn't happen in a K-12 school. So it is a school, music school outside of a school that Dan attended through high school and had Gena Raps as his piano teacher. And this relationship that they describe is incredibly intimate. It is the details of what they remember about the work that they did together, down to particular pieces of music that Dan played, down to the kinds of skills that Gena worked on with him, is really a testament to how these relationships are the foundation of identity building and professional practice. There's some really amazing moments where they talk about times that they both remember where they went through an entire lesson and never touched a piano at all, which is not what you think of when you think of pre-professional music school training. So it was a really remarkable window into how these very intense, intimate musical relationships get built. Made even more impressive to me by the fact, and I will tell you this now, even though it doesn't get revealed until the end of the episode, Gena is 84 years old. And so her memory for this work with individual students is remarkable. And her energy for talking about how to play music, how to teach music, how to create musicians is incredibly inspiring. And of course, it's always a joy for me to have those conversations with somebody who's in my life, who has been in my life, who was a roommate of mine. And so I really hope you enjoy this conversation between Dan Lipton and Gena Raps. Listeners, it is a great day because I have with me one of my bestest and oldest friends, pianist, composer, and accompanist to the stars, Dan Lipton. Most of the artists we have here on Arts Educators Save the World are multi-hyphenates, meaning they wear a lot of hats. But Dan may have them all beat He wears so many hats, he looks like the guy from my favorite childhood book, Caps for Sale. Dan works on Broadway as a conductor and a musician. Fun fact, he conducted Sting in Sting's own musical. He's probably been in the pit for almost every musical that's had a run on Broadway since 2000. He also works as a music director for incredible music collaborations like the Twyla Tharp T-Bone Burnett piece, How Long Blues, and Tom Stoppard's The Coast of Utopia. These days, Dan is primarily a band leader. He tours with musical superstars Kelly O'Hara, Sutton Foster, and Mandy Gonzalez, and he has also worked with John Lithgow and Audra McDonald, playing in the greatest musical venues in the U.S., Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, and the Kennedy Center, and with the most accomplished orchestras in the world. Another final fun fact about Dan, he composes music for film scores and podcasts, including this one. That's right, Dan is a member of the Arts Educators Save the World family. Dan makes it all look easy, and he makes his front women look good. I know a lot about Dan's arts education, but I've never gotten to meet the person who makes Dan look good. Dan, welcome to Arts Educators Save the World.
Oh, wow. Thank you. That was an amazing introduction.
My pleasure.
It sounds like I did some stuff. But the person who taught me how to do some stuff, so I know how to do some stuff.
That's right.
The music teacher who I think taught me more years than any other music teacher I had, and certainly who I had the closest kind of teacher-student collaborative musical relationship with. This was at the Mannes School of Music in New York City when I was in high school, and I am pleased to welcome to the show with me today. Her name is Gena Raps.
Yay!
Good morning. Thank you.
Welcome, Gena.
Thank
Cue
you.
applause.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled at the career that you've made. It's really stunning.
Thank you.
The way I like to get us started is for each of you to talk a little bit about the first time that you remember working together, your earliest memory of being together. It is okay if it is not the same memory. In fact, that is often a delightful way to reconnect. So each of you have been thinking on it for about 15 seconds. And whomever would like to start, tell us about the first time you remember working together.
Wow. Okay. I actually do not remember the first lesson. I don't remember the first day of Mannes, but just if I could paint the picture a little bit, Mannes School of Music is a college level music school in New York City. It's now part of the new school. I think when I was in the high school prep division of Mannes back in the early 90s, I don't know if it was part of the new school yet, but they did have a high school program that I started going to on Saturdays. So basically every Saturday, my dad would drive me into the city from New Jersey, and I would get a full day of what I now call my superhero musical training. So I don't remember the first day, but what I do remember is my first semester course load. And I remember I was so excited because I was going to go to jazz band, and that was not a thing I could do in my school in New Jersey. So the idea that I was going to have jazz band, and then I was also going to have a private jazz piano lesson aside from that. And then I was also going to have a private voice lesson. And then I was also going to have a private music theory lesson. And then on top of all that, I was also going to have a classical piano lesson, a private lesson with Gena Raps. And so what I do remember is that I was least excited for the classical piano lesson with Gena Raps. That's what I remember about not the first day, but the first just semester. I was most excited to get to, in other words, the things that I hadn't done before, because I had a classical piano teacher. I'd had several at that point by that time in New Jersey. And now I knew I was going to go study with, a bigger, more fancy one in New York City, but I was mostly excited for all those other classes. How's that?
Okay, the one you left out, which is really important, was ear training. Mannes really specializes in ear training.
That's what I meant by music theory, that private lesson.
It wasn't an individual ear training class?
Yeah, it was. It was a combination, if I remember, of ear training and counterpoint and music theory. And that is definitely the course that made me the musician that I am in many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mannes had the best ear training and the best theory program in the world. If you wanted to major in theory, you came to Mannes. As a matter of fact, Juilliard ultimately rated our teachers. They came in and they hired our teachers because our program was so strong.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell listeners what ear training is and how you, like, what is ear training and what is the pedagogy of ear training and why is that so important?
Well, if you need to be a composer, you need to hear in your head and be able to write down what you've just heard. So I can only compare it to if I'm speaking and you're going to write down my words, you need to be able to write down the music or just be able to play it once you've heard it. It's a skill. It's an important skill.
I would define it also as a skill that people with perfect pitch don't need to train in because they just know that this note is an A or whatever. I don't have perfect pitch. But what I do know, thanks to my ear training, is that if I hear this note and whatever note this is, and you ask me to sing a third above it, I can go to there and that's the third above it. And I know that that's a third above it. And that's ear training. And so knowing, I can hear in my head where notes are, where intervals are. That came from ear training at Mannes. And I will say that, Erica, once you and I were in school at Northwestern together, at Northwestern, the School of Music, the freshman year, everyone has to take essentially an ear training course. And when I got there, I basically placed out of it because of my training at Mannes. So that does say, so the proof is in the pudding.
Right.
So, Gena, what do you remember about Dan? Young Dan Lipton arrives at Mannes.
Of course, he was you could only get into the school if you're very gifted. There's an audition. So obviously he was very gifted. But I have to tell you, he may not remember this. Technically, the way he physically approached the piano was all wrong. And so he may not have been excited about studying with me. I had to fix everything. I had to make a real pianist of him. His shoulders were tight. His arms were tight. He would never be able to have the career he has now, playing so much, using his hands. Your hands are that's your equipment. And he was tied up in knots. But what I do remember is once I showed him how to fix all of this, he went home and he fixed it so fast. Now you're talking about years and years of an instrument playing it wrong, being tight and having your body tied up in knots. But he was so fast to fix everything. That was very impressive. Do you remember that, Dan?
Yeah, I do remember that. I mean, my first piano teacher was my grade school music teacher, and he was not any master piano teacher. He was the grade school music teacher who just happened to also teach piano on the side. And he was great for starting me out, but he was not worried about technique as much as he was just worried about communicating the basics to me, which he definitely did. And then I went through a few other teachers in New Jersey before I went to Mannes. And I think what she's talking about is when I got there, I was almost just like an amalgamation of like three different styles, of like three different people who had tried to train me, but I was still just doing my own thing kind of, And so she definitely gave me tools and discipline. And it sounds so simple to just say like, your posture was bad, sit up straight. But like, it's not just that, it's how to hold your arms. It's how to know how much force to give to get certain dynamics. It's about reserving your strength. It's almost like athletic training over time. I would compare it to because you have to know how to pace yourself. If you have a recital coming up and you have to play a 3 movement sonata, which is what I would have to do a lot when I was 16, then, that is like an athletic thing to prepare for, to have the stamina to do that. And also mental, just the memory of it also. But, and that's, I think, why maybe young pianists, or I remember maybe getting tight, is because you're caught up in your mind, like remembering the piece, and then you forget about what your body is doing. And so, I think you work over time for it to all be kind of second nature.
And at that point, it was years of misuse. So for him to go home, and I think he fixed it in a month. It was really impressive.
Well, I really wanted to be good.
The thing that's so lovely about that to me is I think and talk a lot about the embodied nature of arts practices and how, unlike traditional academics, where we focus almost exclusively on, quote unquote, the mind, and we think of learning and doing in the body as something you do when you need a break from learning, or something wholly outside what's happening for learners in their heads. And so I love that the very first place that you went when talking about how Dan learned to become an accomplished artist is in the embodied aspect and in the relationship between the mind and the body. And that's something that I am often talking with educators about when we talk about why arts practices are such good models for what it means to do good teaching and learning. So I love that that's kind of the first place that you went, right? It wasn't to, yes, theory, but it's about how all of those ideas are embodied in space and in relationship between the instrument and the person. It's very cool.
It was essential.
Gena, tell me about your career decision to teach at outside of the K-12 education system, and how being a teacher of the arts in this kind of, I don't want to call it informal, because Dan, what you described is a very formalized curriculum, right? So it's not like,
serious.
A summer camp or a, nonprofit arts organization. It's very serious, but it's not school. Can you talk a little bit about Manus as a learning organization and how you function as an educator there?
Well, I studied with very great people. I was very lucky. I studied with one of the great artists of the 20th century. And it becomes important to pass on that knowledge. I have a career myself. I'm a pianist. I concertize, I record. But to pass on that knowledge is very, very important to me. And so as I had my own career, I was always interested in teaching gifted young people.
And Dan, how did you find out about Manus as a learning place?
Yeah, I should have actually brushed up on this with my mom before I got on this call, but because it was more my parents or my mom probably doing some research. But I'm going to tie this to the summer camp that you and I went to, which is called French Woods. I started going to French Woods, which is a performing arts summer camp, when I was 10. And we found that because I wanted to rock. I wanted to play in rock bands. And there were other music camps, but French Woods was the only camp that had music and also actually had an activity called rock band that you could sign up for. Whereas, there were some other like classical music camps. And I think I already knew at age 10 that I was going to be about more music than just practicing Bach and Beethoven. And, I was playing the Billy Joel stuff and I was starting to improvise. And so the impulse to go to the performing arts camp for the first time was to find, where else could I play other music? And I think that the impulse to then get more serious, quote unquote, with my musical education in general, by the time I was a freshman in high school, that was pretty obvious that this was my talent, this was my skill, this was the thing that I loved doing all the time, that I wanted to develop. And I also was lucky enough to be, born somewhat of white privilege in upper middle class Jewish northern New Jersey right outside New York City, and I was an only child. And so I think, there weren't any other kids for my parents to spend their hard-earned dollars on. And so I really did benefit from, I think, that level of attention and in, just like support from my parents and kind of, they let me follow what I was interested in to the point of sending me to this special camp. And then when I got even more serious, it was, okay, we need to send him to a special school in New York. And I think it was a similar thing where at the time, we're talking about 1989, I guess. At the time, everyone knows Juilliard and most people know Manhattan School of Music. And then I guess there's also Mannes. And at the time, Juilliard had no jazz at all. They were a purely classical school and college. I believe Manhattan at the time had jazz for college students. They had a high school program, but it didn't have jazz yet. That high school program was still all classical. And then Mannes, what we found out, I remember, is that they had a high school program, and that program also had jazz. And so that's how I ended up in Mannes. Again, it was like to find the other thing. It was to find, and that's what I was saying before, like I was probably most excited about on the first day was getting to that jazz band, getting to that jazz lesson. So I don't remember the process. I do think it was probably more my mom doing research, but I do remember that being ding, ding, ding. That's the fun thing that I can do there, in addition to all the serious training. What I didn't realize was that the jazz training at Mannes was going to be just as serious and like mind breaking as any other training there. I got real serious jazz training from amazing New York working jazz pianists when I was 14, 15, 16.
Mannes was the new school were the first to have a jazz program before Juilliard, and their jazz program is really tops. I mean, it equals Juilliard easily now.
Yeah, definitely.
And it sounds like one of the great affordances of this being a weekend school that is a school outside of traditional K-12 school is that it can be staffed by folks like you, Gena, and by these jazz musicians because during the day on Saturday is a good time, right, for working artists to commit themselves to I don't even want to call it a side hustle, but to a teaching hustle. Can you talk about how like the cadence of your life as an artist and an educator? In other words, what does your schedule look like, and how does teaching fit into your life as an artist?
Well, at the moment, I would say I taught at Sarah Lawrence. I taught college at Sarah Lawrence. And I did teach some college at Mannes. But the most interesting is to teach in pre-college because you're getting this raw talent. And that's where you set all of the aesthetic ideas that need to be set. So by the time these talented kids get to college, certain things have to be settled. The use of their body, the sound concept. You have a lot of kids coming in banging away. Banging just doesn't go in the professional world. And if you don't have that settled in your ear, that you know what a beautiful sound is by the time you get to college, forget it. It's not going to happen because that's the body-mind connection. You have to love your sound also. And that's developed in a pre-college situation. So, as I said, I have this incredible legacy of teaching, of having studied with very great artists, and I've always loved teaching young talent.
I want to build on what she's saying about, I did learn a ton of technical knowledge from Gena, but just as important, maybe more important almost, is the kind of emotional intelligence that comes with your musicality. And so the idea of being able to tap into emotion at any time, essentially like being an actor, almost like being trained so that your technique falls away, so that your technique is just assumed and you trust that it's going to be there, What you can't always trust is going to be there is like an emotional connection to what you're playing, especially if you're a working musician who's just, doing whatever gig you got called for today, or you're playing a Broadway show for the 8th time this week. You still have to deliver on, a level of sound that is only going to come with a kind of emotional connection. And knowing how to access that even on an off day, I think, is one of the greatest lessons I learned as a high school, developing musician, because that then, as she was just saying, like, you have to love your sound and know your sound and know it well enough to know, how much force to give, to get certain volume, to get the emotional intelligence, the emotional integrity of what the music is trying to communicate. And if you have all that in your back pocket, then like me, when you get to college, like that's all just kind of like second nature. And so then me accompanying a singer or making up music for the college improv group, whatever it is, I can do it with a level of security and also just like realness of emotional realness, even if I'm not necessarily feeling that in the moment. It's almost like learning how to be an actor. So I've never even articulated that before, but hearing Gena talk about it a little bit, I was kind of realizing that, I was kind of thinking back, Gena, on some of our lessons, which sometimes I wouldn't even play. Like, I remember entire hours where we would just talk about, almost just like philosophy sessions, about what it means to make music, what it means to conjure sound. And like, I would leave having barely played, but leave with a head full of things to think about when I go home and practice. So I'm not just practicing by rote. So I'm not just learning notes and trying to hit the mark of numbers, but so I'm learning how to imbue it with something. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and sparked so many more.
Well, let me just say that you were a very special case, because you told me from the beginning that your parents did not want you to be a musician. And so I spent a lot of time, sort of helping you integrate the idea that, you need to have courage. It's a very hard world out there. It's true. It's very hard to make a career, especially now with, so many people coming from abroad, that you needed to give yourself a chance to do that. You never know until you're on the firing line whether you can do it. And one other point, I just want to tell you a story. My friend was the second woman in the Philharmonic. And when she retired, she gave the most exquisite speech. Now, you have to understand, she's at Philharmonic Hall. It was Philharmonic Hall at the time, and it's huge, and it was full. And she got up in front of the orchestra, and she thanked everybody. She said, some people have the most dire tragedies at home, but when they get to the orchestra and they play their concert, they give 150%. And in a sense, that's what, if everything is built in, if you have your technique and you have your concepts about how you want something to sound and what you're trying to relate through the music, then you're right. You have to you just automatically tap into it, no matter what else is going in the rest of your life.
I want to talk more about this idea that I hear bubbling around what I want to posit is thinking about learning as the development of a musical identity. But before we do that, I want to ask Gena about those lessons that Dan was describing, where maybe you don't play, maybe it's more of a philosophical conversation. Do you design those by the each? In other words, when you have a student, are you assessing like, okay, my work with them over a semester is going to go in this direction, and so this lesson is going to be about this topic and we're not going to play? Or does it emerge kind of as you sit down together at the piano?
It emerges, it's very personal. That's what's so amazing about this one-to-one relationship, that, I don't pre-think it, but I get to know what each student really needs. And Dan needed, what shall I say, the value system that you can be a musician and you can make a life as a musician, because it was alien to where his parents were coming from. His parents wanted him to be a good Jewish boy, get a good job, and be secure. When you're a musician, you're not secure. But it doesn't matter if, you get to the level that Dan has gotten. So I needed to open that world for him, because being an artist is a different kind of a life.
Mm-hmm.
How many students would you say, approximately, how many students have you had in your career in this Mannes pre-college sort of high school world?
God, I never thought about that. I had a lot. Many. I have a lot of really good, successful students, and some who have built lives, in the corporate world. I've had students who've gone back and went to Wharton and now work at Google, but music is part of their life. So it really varies. Yeah. But, you respond to the need of each student.
Well, that's what I was going to both point out and ask about, which is that's a huge burden on and challenge for an educator, right? To essentially craft an individualized pedagogy for 100 different people. I guess I want to point that out and say that, for many educators, they look for guidance for how to develop that strategy. And wondering kind of, did you get that kind of guidance? In other words, I know there's sort of schools that can prepare you to become a music teacher, but this doesn't sound like that. This kind of approach doesn't sound like that. So how do you learn to make those relationships?
I guess it's just experiential. I mean, I was at Juilliard when I was a baby, 7. And my teachers, I learned about life.
That's a real prodigy, by the way. That's a prodigy.
I learned about life.
I had my first piano lesson when I was 7, and it was not at Juilliard.
My teachers I was very close with my teachers. They knew what my emotional issues were. And it was part of my upbringing. And I guess because of that tradition, I've been able to bring it to my students also. Yeah, I have some very interestingly challenged, emotionally challenged students right now, actually. That's a whole other conversation.
It's an emotionally challenging time. I'm not surprised to hear you say that, actually, right? To hear you say that your relationships with teenagers are more emotionally charged in 2025 than they were in 1990. I'm sure it sounds like you're meeting that moment, through this now long history of these relationships, you're able to meet that moment.
Gena was talking about opening up the world musically for me, and I think that's another big thing that I got out of studying with her, which is that when I came in there when I was 14, again, I was psyched to be in jazz band. I was psyched to play the Elton John songs and the Billy Joel songs and to nail those piano solos. And when I got a little older, it was more Sondheim. It was more like I was studying all the Stephen Sondheim scores and trying to master all that tricky piano playing, which again came from the camp that we went to, where I was working a lot at that camp as an accompanist. And so the better I could nail like the hardest Sondheim song, like the cooler I'm going to be, essentially, right? So I think I would always come back like after a summer at French Woods and be back at Mannes, and I would be all like about that music. And I seem to recall, Gena, that you would kind of humor me and, listen to me sing through the Elton John song, listen to me like show you this great Sondheim song that I would thought was the greatest thing ever. But then she would point me to classical music that kind of satisfied that. So stuff like Ravel, stuff like Maurice Ravel, which is one of Sondheim's biggest influences, Ravel. And so I remember one of my signature pieces that I remember doing at my senior recital was the Sonatine by Ravel. And I really think that came about because you were just listening to what I was into. And, you brought me on to Bartók, and that was another one, a piece, the Bartók,
Opus 14.
Microcosmos or no, the Bartók Sonata.
Microcosmos.
It was the Bartók Sonata that I did. And that came from, so he loves these like poundy, Billy Joel, Elton John solos. So like, let's get him on this Bartók piece where he can do that, but do it classically, And, Debussy, the Sunken Cathedral piece, and like very kind of evocative, film score-y, theatrical kind of classical music that, had a little bit of like connecting the dots to either, the Ravel connects to jazz, the Ravel connects to Sondheim, the Debussy connects to film score music, the Bartók connects to Billy Joel piano solos. So I do remember, again, I said earlier that I was not psyched for the classical piano lesson, but I think over time, over the 4 years that I spent with Gena at Mannes, I became as excited for the classical piano lesson because I was playing such cool stuff that I never thought was possible when I was 9 years old, just like practicing the Mozart and the Beethoven and Bach. I never knew that there was something as cool as Debussy or Ravel out there, or Bartók. So I think that's a huge thing for me.
And should we go to the ultimate? So of course he won the concerto competition.
We can segue to the ultimate. Yeah. Yes.
Which was so great. He did Rhapsody in Blue with the orchestra.
And Erica was there. Erica was there that day when I played Rhapsody in Blue with the Mannes Orchestra when I was 16. So yeah, I got to play the Rhapsody in Blue because I won this concerto competition. Yeah, it was the ultimate teacher-student journey to learn Rhapsody in Blue and master it and then win the concerto competition and then play it. But the other thing that I remember was that there was a huge kerfuffle at the school over whether Rhapsody in Blue counted as a classical concerto. And so I almost got like disqualified from the competition just because of the piece that I chose. And it was down to me and this girl who had chosen an actual, real quote unquote classical concerto. And in the end, I remember it was like this, this death match wrestling kind of thing between me and this girl. And she like freaked out and chickened out and quit or something. And then I just won. Yeah. She was like, the pressure got to her and all this like kerfuffle. Do you remember this? Am I making this up? I just remember us like defending Gershwin. And I very much, okay, well, I don't think this was all in my head. I remember
classical music cage match. I am here for it.
It was a cage match, and the school and some of the and the conductor of the orchestra. This isn't a real concerto. I mean, that's what they always say about Rhapsody in Blue. Anyway, Rhapsody in Blue, one of the most challenging piano concertos, I maintain. Yeah, I mean that was like a project. That was a year-long project. I remember,
and it was gorgeous.
Pulling apart.
He played gorgeously.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
That I remember very well.
Now, one other thing, a negative part of that experience, if you remember, was the conductor of that orchestra was not a fan of me. I had a chip on my shoulder, and I was not polite to the conductor. So I just wanted to have some humility here and use it as a teaching moment that you always have to respect the conductor. And I don't know if I fully did when I was 16. I think I was really psyched that I'd won the competition and I was going to like get to do all the flashy solos, and I was not the best collaborator with the conductor of the orchestra. And now that I spend a lot of my time playing with orchestras around the country, I am very conscious of, my relationship with those conductors who sometimes I just meet on the day of the show and have to kind of forge a good musical relationship with over just, a 2.5 hour rehearsal. Cold hard lessons that I learned as a teenager at Manus that are still definitely with me.
Is learning about collaboration in that way part of the education at Manus?
Well, I don't know if you took chamber music, but chamber music is a very strong course at school. Yeah, you were too busy with the jazz, but in jazz you were collaborating with other people.
That's right. Yeah, in jazz band, that's where I would get that. It's a different kind of musical communication because you're improvising. And you're right. If I didn't do that, I probably would have been in a chamber music trio or something where I was playing with, string players all the time. But I never had that. So I had a lot of I had a lot of one-on-one. I mean, like she said, it really was a big one-on-one place for me between the music theory and ear training stuff and then a voice lesson and classical and jazz. Like I had private lessons in all those. The jazz band was the one place where I did, communicate with other musicians. And it's just on this other level. I remember the recital I did at the end of Manus, the senior recital, like after all the Rhapsody, after all that. I remember my recital was half classical and half jazz. Like I did like a set of the Debussy and Ravel and Bartok, and then we took an intermission and I came back with a jazz trio, piano, bass, drums, and we did like a Bill Evans set, essentially of improvising. So I remember that being as much as the Gershwin day, one of like the best musical days of my young life was, playing a gig like that where I could do all that music in one gig. And again, I think by then I was past the idea of showing off, it's which is the other thing about like musical maturity and kind of like emotional intelligence in your musicality. It's like you get to a point where, okay, like I know I can play the rocking solo and I can play the most complicated part of the piece, but it's not really about that. It's about communicating in emotion. So, by the time I was at that senior recital, I think I had basically learned that. So that's what I remember being proud about with that gig is that I wasn't showing off anymore. I was just making music.
Showing off doesn't go well in my studio. It has to be real.
Yeah,
it has to be
exactly. Yeah, that's what
connected
I mean.
To the music and connected to what the composer said or what the lyrics say. There has to be a strong connection. Mm-hmm. Showing off is, it's just not important because we develop technique. And once you have the technique, it's just there. It's yours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you teach that explicitly, Gena? Or is that implicit in the way you work with students?
Well, it's implicit in the music. When you're analyzing a score, you're looking at what the music says, and that's what's important.
Mm-hmm. I would make a comparison maybe to something like ballet, where if you know dance at all, and people talk about like the line of a dancer, like kind of the arc of their body and how they move their body. Like musical lines kind of work the same way, and for you to play a musical line the way it's intended, like so it has shape and dynamics and emotion to it. You kind of do have to, again, like think like an actor or a dancer to like follow that line through, right? And so I think what she's talking about is like, learning how to look at music on a page. And I think when you're young, learning this, you really are writing out with a pencil, and making notes on the score about how things are going to go. I think over time you internalize that, and your brain just knows how to do that, and like she's saying, it's just like a skill that is just there. There's the line that I need to bring out, and this is how I'm going to do it. Like that's just an inherent thing over time.
And when we worked on Rhapsody in Blue, we were very analytical about the lines and where the line's going and what's the point of that line and where the movement goes forward to, wherever it goes. We did a lot of that with Rhapsody in Blue, shaping it beautifully. Which is why he won.
Practice makes perfect.
This is a bit of a naive question, but I was wondering when you were talking about the ego piece of it, whether there's something unique about piano as an instrument in that way because there is so much solo playing that is possible and encouraged, as opposed to, say, being a string instrumentalist, right? Like, obviously you're taking lessons solo, but it is almost never the case, right, that your performance work is just you. You are almost always training to be inserted into a collaborative practice. With
that's a good
piano,
point.
that's not always the case, right? And
Right.
so I didn't know if there was something maybe special about, and voice, I guess, is like that. Maybe guitar could also be that way. I don't know. I'm just curious, Dan, what you think about that, about sort of the nature of piano as an instrument.
I mean, you're right in that a string player is going to have a lot of private lessons, and they're really, though, prepping to be put in a big orchestra. They're not prepping for a solo gig as a violinist. That's going to be very rare. Whereas for a pianist, it can kind of go either way. I will say that, I didn't have a lot of experience playing with orchestras. That's maybe the one thing that I didn't get in college, where we went at Northwestern, because by the time I got there, I entered as a classical piano major, but then I switched to music composition. And then, even though in our minds you remember me playing piano a lot, I wasn't doing it a lot with big orchestras. And so I didn't really have that skill that really in my pocket when I graduated and moved to New York, which is why when I first tried to play on Broadway, subbing for a keyboard player on Broadway, I failed miserably because I really had no idea how to really follow a conductor. Playing Rhapsody in Blue as the soloist is different because it's almost like the conductor's following you. But following a conductor is something that string player is trained for and has played in orchestras their whole, aside from the private lessons, they've also been playing in orchestras for all these years, and they know to follow a conductor.
Right, exactly.
And I had to really learn how to follow a conductor. And partially how I did that was I learned how to conduct. And this was after college. Like, I never even knew how to conduct until after college. And a Broadway music director named Ted Sperling took me under his wing, and he's probably my main mentor in life and in theater. And he taught me the basics of how to conduct. And then I knew how to follow a conductor more once I knew how to be a conductor. And I'm a really bad conductor. I'm not good at it. I mean, I know how to wave my arms, but it's I'm much better at a piano kind of conducting with my head and my body than I am just like standing on a podium being a real baton conductor. But it's not something that I had any experience with. And so I think there is something about piano as a solo instrument that you're practicing a lot for these solo piano recitals. You're not necessarily practicing to be put in this larger context. I don't know. That was my experience. It doesn't mean every pianist is like that, but that was my experience.
Well, I mean, I was just thinking about you reflecting on at 16, right? Not necessarily having the respect for the conductor that you soon realized you needed to have, and whether that is partly a result of being the kind of instrumentalist who is really thinking mostly exclusively about the relationship between yourself and the piano.
I think you're totally right. I was a little bit of a selfish musician. And you are just like thinking about yourself and how good you look and how much you are in control. I'm not a good conductor. I know how to conduct. I'm better conducting with my body and my head while I'm playing piano. That's called piano conductor style. But putting me on a podium with a baton I'm not gonna be able to conduct that orchestra very well.
And I think that goes back to the very beginning of our conversation about how Gena's started with you on this embodied practice, right? Mm-hmm. And conducting is embodied, but it doesn't connect directly to the music or to the instrument, right? It's your body in space by itself. Yeah. And that's a different kind of embodiment, right? And requires connecting to the others who are connected to their instruments, which takes me back to an emerging idea that I had just as you've been both talking about what it means to learn in this way and what you're learning. In schools, we focus so much on learning as content, acquiring content, right? But there are folks in the formal schooling world who talk about the importance of identity work in learning. So we talk about, say, kids having a STEM identity, right? An identity as a science, technology, engineering, mathematics learner. And that identity work is through content, but isn't necessarily about content. And I've heard a lot of that in your talk, that part of what the work of teaching in these spaces is about the development of a musical identity. And I just wondered if that resonates with you both, and what you think about, understanding teaching and learning in these spaces as kind of the development of a musical identity.
It's absolutely true, because, I knew who Dan was. I knew what his interests were, so I gave him appropriate repertoire. So, that's part of it.
What I was saying before also is, like, when I entered Manus, I didn't really have a musical identity. My musical identity was very generic and typical, and what you would expect from a kid born when I was, who grew up where I did, But by the time I left Manus, I had a musical identity in that I just knew so much more about all kinds of music, and I knew what I liked and didn't and why. And I still wasn't a fully formed musician. I still didn't really know what I was going to actually do for a living. I knew I was going to go to college as a classical piano major. I had no intention of being a classical pianist. It was just like, well, that's the ticket in. That's what got me into this school. And I think, as Gena alluded to before, I think even at that point, my parents still did not want me to, or did not believe that I really had the talent to make it as a musician. And I think my mom was half expecting me to change my major to journalism at Northwestern, and it made her comfy that there were, fallback things to do at Northwestern. But
because journalism is such a stable and secure profession in the year 2025.
Yes, she was very prescient. But I think I knew that I was going to stay in music. I did not know, though, exactly what I was going to do in music. And so I just knew what I wasn't going to do. I knew that I was majoring in something I was not going to do, right? Majoring in classical piano that I had no intention of doing. So it was kind of like, well, I've got 4 years to figure out what it is. And it ended up being writing for theater, and that's why I changed my major to composition. But so all that, though, is about musical identity, and I wouldn't have reached that decision when I did without all that musical identity forging back in high school. Like I got so advanced through Manus and Gena and my training in high school that, again, was not part of my public school system. It was this other thing on weekends, but that gave me the tools to have a musical identity, so that when it was really time to make that choice, I could, with confidence, decide, no, I'm going to do this now. I'm going to actually get a degree in this, and we really are going for this. I'm still trying to look for my real musical identity. I mean, it is a lifelong thing, right?
What it isn't, which is what I love to hear, is that it isn't technique qua technique. Like, identity is sort of embedded in how you use those technical ideas in the context of things that you care about.
Oh, yeah.
And the fact that 30 some odd years later, you remember which composers Gena directed you to as a result of your interests, to me, is such a clear articulation of how musical identity is created through your relationship and the music that you made together.
Yeah. One thing that I've realized now, looking back on not just my time with Gena, but with several of my different music teachers, is that they treated me as an adult, in the sense that I was not treated as an adult in life as soon as I was treated as an adult in the arts. Like, I was treated as an adult in music and in the arts much earlier than I was in life. So the idea that when I was 14, people were actually listening to my taste, and what Gena was talking about, like and what I was saying before, like I came in with a certain set of ideals or tastes, and she listened to that and then responded to that, but she did it not in a way that was prescriptive, and not in a way that was condescending, and not in a way that was pushing her own musical values on me, right? And so I think that thinking back, like that's a common thread with a lot of the music teachers I had, is that they treated me like an adult in music, and let my taste and my musicality lead the way. So I think that is important.
I think that's super important, and we talk about that in other arts education spaces, really in terms of taking students' assets seriously, like taking what they bring into the space as a serious component of what it means to build a learning environment. But I love that you perceived it, you experienced it as being treated like an adult, right? That having your expertise treated with respect, was what you experienced as a kind of adulthood. So I love that perspective.
Music is the one pursuit that a child can do that's an adult activity. So a child can't do physics, a child can't do higher math, most children, but music is accessible to young people. That's another thing that makes it really special, and it develops all these marvelous things that your brain and your body.
Yeah, no barrier to entry.
And I want to point out that, in fact, if we treated physics the way we treat music, perhaps there would be no barrier to entry there as well.
Right.
My perspective as an educator is that we've created those barriers by siloing off the technical knowledge you need to do physics from the concepts of physics, which are actually quite accessible, quite experiential, and potentially ideas that kids have in their experiences in the world that they could bring in. But we have said as educators, oh, no, you can't possibly do that until you learn A, B, C, and D. So my yes and to that would be, but what if we treated some of these other disciplines in the way we treat good music education, which is bring what you've got into the space, and together we will co-construct what it means to make and do physics. So my soapbox about that.
Well, music is the one art that goes directly to the emotions. So that does set it apart.
I'm sure someone gets emotional about physics, but it's not me.
I mean, physicists do.
You get emotional about it, but it doesn't go directly to the emotions the way music does.
No, I appreciate that pushback, right? Because my interest is in, this is called Arts Educators Save the World, right? And so I want to not just highlight the way these teaching and learning practices have made your careers sing, but also lessons for folks who are listening who are like, well, I'm not a classical concert pianist, but I want to work with kids to give them access to things that I care about. And what are some strategies for doing that? And so I think the heuristic, I would say, is take kids' ideas seriously, use them as assets in whatever discipline you're working with them in, with the caveat, as you said, Gena, that music is special because of its natural emotional directness. Yeah, I love that. That's great. What a great place to make a final turn, which is, I'm curious about, for both of you, what you're up to now and how what this conversation we've had informs the work that you do. So, Gena, are you still with Manus? How has your practice changed? How has it not changed? And then Dan, you can tell us a little bit about your current work.
Well, I just I have a new CD that is about to go out. I recorded all the Haydn flute trios with Carol Winsence, who's the queen of the flute. So that's very exciting personally. And I have some concerts in Europe.
That is exciting.
I mostly teach prodigies now. I used to teach everybody, but now and I have some incredible gifts in my class. I mean, the level of young people and their ability is so far above what I started out with at Juilliard. I mean, I had a parent of a 4-year-old call me and I said, no, I won't take a 4-year-old. And then they brought her to me, and she was watching her sister's piano lessons. And of course, she was incredible. She played better than her sister. So yes, I started working with her. And I have a lot of these very high-level pianists now. A bunch of them played at Carnegie Hall. They won a competition. So the level is very high, and it is very exciting. Okay, so I'm very old now. I'm 84, and I was not going to schlep down to Mannes anymore. So I'm now at Manhattan School of Music. I teach there instead. But Manhattan School, because of the competition and the level so high, they've really come up. And a lot of people go to Manhattan School rather than go to Juilliard these days, because the level, sort of the competition has forced the level of that school to come up.
This is a very surface level thing to say, but for listeners, we are on video. Gena looks about 62 years old. If you would have asked me how old you were, I would have said in your early 60s. I am gobsmacked after talking for an hour and a half to find out that you are 84 years old, and that you are still recording, traveling the world and doing concerts in Europe and teaching 4-year-olds. I mean, talk about arts educators save the world.
Right.
Holy moly. Okay, Dan, what are you doing?
Well, I'm not teaching any 4-year-old prodigies. But yeah, I will be at Carnegie Hall in November with the singer Mandy Gonzalez, who's one of the theater stars who I accompany. And we're doing an entire concert of music by Lin-Manuel Miranda, the first guest of this podcast, I believe. And so a lot of my time is spent doing these kinds of gigs. My bread and butter these days is these kind of orchestra concerts with fancy Broadway singers, is how I like to say. And so Mandy Gonzalez is one of them, and Kelly O'Hara is one who I've been with for almost 20 years. And then Kelly and Sutton Foster also have a show that they do that's a duo show that's kind of a tribute to Julie Andrews and Carol Burnett. And we're going to be this summer doing that show with basically every major orchestra. So we're doing the Boston Pops at Tanglewood, and we're doing the Chicago Symphony Orchestra at Ravinia Festival. We're doing Wolf Trap in Virginia with the National Symphony Orchestra. So it's really like, to me, this is where the 30 or 35-year dreaming and training and manifesting really comes through, because I have been wanting to do these kinds of gigs my whole life, to be at Ravinia with the CSO and some Broadway stars that's a dream gig. And also where I'm not just playing, but where I have some arrangements on the program, where I have an orchestration on the program, where I've written a song that's on the program. So it's really, you started this call, you were talking about the many hats that I wear, and that's kind of the joy right now, or at least this year, is I have a lot of these gigs where I really am wearing like all those hats at once and making music at a really high level. So that's a lot of my summer and rest of the year is orchestra concerts with these big Broadway stars.
And do you get young musicians who want to be like you reaching out to you for mentorship and advice?
Good question. A little bit. It's funny because I don't teach. I don't really have an impulse to teach in the traditional sense. And I clearly, I have so many friends who have asked me over time, hey, can you give my kid piano lessons? And I'm always like, you do not want that. I would get so frustrated so fast. But what I've come to learn about myself as I've gotten older in this business is that I do have knowledge to impart on just kind of a talking level. So I'm really good in a talk back, right? I'm really good in a Q&A. And now with a lot of these singers who I work with, we often do concerts at university performing arts centers where there's like a master class built into the weekend or a Q&A session. And I'm usually included at this point because there usually is some music kid or some piano player out there who wants to ask a question specific to the accompanist. And so I've learned that I'm good at a Q&A. I can give I'm good with an anecdote. I'm good with describing something that I failed at 20 years ago, and this was what I learned from it. I'm good at that, but I don't have the patience, I don't think, to sit there and really what Gena does and listen to young musicians and actually make them better technique wise. No, I'm not that. But I do some degree of mentorship, and yes, once in a while there are people who reach out and want to just like take me out to coffee and ask how I got there or, how I have forged this path. And so I'm, always more than happy to talk about it.
Well, Dan and Gena, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your histories and your co-musical education. It's always a joy to hear people who are so expert in their practice be able to articulate how they came to know and do what they do. And it's just a joy. And, I started this by saying Dan is one of my oldest and bestest friends. So it is also a joy for me to get to hear you talk through that history and to know some of that superhero origin story. So thank you both very much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I think my favorite thing about having musicians on this show is that unlike other art forms where people have to describe what it is they're doing, here we get to experience the art that they make in real time. And the fact that Dan had his Rhapsody in Blue performance from when he was 16, for me is like such a incredible way for us all, not only to experience the art, but to experience the art as it was then. And to be able to not only hear them talk about the emotional connection and the emotional learning and the embodied learning, right? I really loved when they talked about how what Dan had to learn was not about the technique of the notes, but about what to do with his body. And then you get to hear him play like that. I think that's just such an amazing aspect. And as Gena said, right, something that makes music and music learning unique from all other art forms. And the voice, listeners, that you maybe are hearing mm-hmming in the background since I've been flying solo is producer Doug, who does not like to be on mic, but has agreed to have a little chat with me here at the end of this podcast. So, Doug, I know that you are a great lover of music, and I know that you and Dan have had a little chance to kind of talk about that, and just wondering, how you experienced this conversation between Dan and his longtime music teacher.
I mean, I think much like so many of the conversations, it's an opportunity to take a trip that you didn't know existed, to a place you didn't know existed. And I mean, I'm able to sit in the back room and listen to all these as we're recording them and then edit them with you. And it's always just it's a little trip that I didn't know was out there. And it's so cool. It always takes me to a place of like earnest appreciation and joy. And there's always something that can be learned from it. And that's why this podcast is so worth doing.
I love taking a trip you didn't know existed. And if I'm being totally honest, although Dan mentioned it in the podcast, until he said it, I had completely forgotten that I attended that performance of Rhapsody in Blue when we were 16. And so for me, it was like watching an old home movie or something that, or listening to an old home movie.
There's a
right?
recall
So like
element in play.
Yeah, like a trip that I was on, sort of like in our conversation with Billy Eichner and Mary Poole, where Billy was talking about those acting exercises. And as soon as he said the words, I had this like visceral response in my body of like transported back to being in Mary's acting class. I had that same experience listening to Dan play something that he played with me in the room, 30 plus years ago.
A little while ago.
Yeah. So Doug, help me out here. We need to take this podcast out, and I heard that you maybe have some ideas for me.
I had a question.
Yes. What is that question?
What are 3 things that you feel like that you normally do in your life that requires some modicum of real attention that you could do while playing an instrument? How, Dan talked about conducting an orchestra while he's playing piano. What are 3 meaningful, important things in your life that you could do while playing an instrument?
Drive a car.
and the instrument would be?
Singing.
One thing.
Dictate a chapter of my novel that I'm writing while playing the ukulele.
How would that sound?
Live on the air? We were going to the beach. Okay, but the novel's not about the beach.
I can't hear
that
the
was just
ukulele,
off the top of my head. No. Okay. That's
okay,
2.
I'll give you 2.
Prep the syllabus for my fall class while badly playing the piano.
You don't have to type?
Prep the syllabus for my fall class while playing the harmonica with a rig attached to
with a
my
headset.
face.
Right. That's great. 3 things. Tali just finished her new class syllabus, and I realized exactly how much work that took with her hands. So
You're right. And I could very easily play the harmonica just as badly without my hands as with my hands.
Yeah.
And so listeners, 3 ways that you can stay involved with our podcast. We would love for you to continue enjoying, to spread the word, to help us bring joy to everyone who loves the arts and learning and Christmas. You can rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. The more ratings we get, the more reviews we get, the higher up it jumps in people's podcast queues.
One thing.
You can send us an email. Tell us how much you love the show. Give us suggestions for guests. If you would like to be on the show, we would love to hear from you. You can reach us at artseducatorspodcast@gmail.com.
2 things.
And feel free to visit our website. We have information about our episodes. We have a link to contact us. We have some additional information on guests. We are here for you at artseducatorspodcast.com.
3 things.
Onward together.
Arts Educators Save the World is hosted by Erica Rosenfeld Halverson and produced and co-hosted by me, Alec Lev. Our executive producer is Doug Matica, and our audio producer is Justin Asher. Special thanks to our collaborators, the brilliant and talented Kate Baldwin, and our great friends at Story Pirate Studios, Lee Overtree, Benjamin Salka, and Amy Fiore. Original music is by Dan Lipton, and our artwork is by Lyra Evans. Check out our website designed by Cole Locasio at www.artseducatorspodcast.com. We're on Instagram at Arts Educators Podcast, and you can write to us with your questions and comments at contact@artseducatorspodcast.com. You can also find us at a place called YouTube. And wherever you're listening, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. It really helps the show. We're proud to be sponsored in part by the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Gibb Faculty Fellowship. Arts Educators Save the World was created by Erica Rosenfeld Halverson and Alec Lev.